Have you ever tried to learn a new skill but gotten discouraged when the learning didn't come as quickly as you'd hoped? Maybe you've tried to learn a new skill in the past but reached a sticking point or a plateau that you just couldn't break through. Have you ever wondered why when learning a skill, sometimes it's super easy and natural to you, but other times it feels super challenging or completely foreign? And for my teachers out there, how frustrating is it when you have a student who, no matter what you try and do, they will only study the skills or the topics they are already good at and neglect everything that they really need to work on? Hi there, welcome to my channel. My name's Mark and I'm a high school math teacher, but more importantly, I'm a lover of learning. In this video, I'm going to be explaining the learning process through this lens of an Inchworm framework. The Inchworm model is something that I experienced in a book by Jared Tendler, and I'll get to that in a moment, but essentially it's a framework for approaching learning in a sequentially, step-by-step way to improve consistency and limit frustration. By the end of this video, I'm going to have answered all 4 of the questions that I asked at the beginning of this video, and hopefully any other questions or feelings you had about the learning process will be answered as well. Now, before we move on any further, I need to define what I mean by a skill, and for that I'm going to use the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of a skill. The ability to use one's knowledge effectively and readily in execution or performance. So with that in mind, some examples of skills that you might find this video is relevant to are learning a language, learning to play a new sport, especially games with a really steep and long learning curve such as golf, learning a musical instrument, learning and building upon math knowledge, learning how to perform a trade, learning how to learn, and many, many more. So not only are we looking at skills, but more importantly, we're looking at the learning process involved in going from complete beginner to master of that skill. So by the end of this video, you will hopefully understand how we acquire and learn new skills, how to be more efficient when it comes to the learning process. You'll have a better understanding of where one of your skills is in the learning process. You're going to understand why we as people can be so inconsistent when learning a new skill, and you're also going to learn a simple technique to become more consistent. And finally, why we plateau when learning a new skill and how to break through those plateaus. Now, the concept behind learning a new skill that I'm going to be covering in this video is called the Inchworm framework or the Inchworm model. However, those imply that the framework is more of a noun. I prefer the verb, so I'm going to be referring to it as the Inchworm method for learning a new skill. Now, I first learned about this method for learning a new skill in a book by Jared Tendler called The Mental Game of Poker. Now, the concept of the Inchworm method is based actually on the animal itself and how it moves through the world. It starts with its front and back legs together, forming a narrow bell curve shape. To move forward, it reaches out with its front half and grabs onto the ground. Then, with its front end firmly attached, it releases its back end and brings it right behind its front half, once again resuming the bell curve shape. It does this over and over to move forward through the world. Moving forward, I'm just going to use a symmetrical curve, also known as a normal distribution, to represent the inchworm. However, I still will be referring to the entire concept or method as the Inchworm model, just for clarity. So what does an inchworm's way of moving through the world have anything to do with learning a new skill? Well, the beauty of the Inchworm model is it considers both parts of a learner's progress. Their strengths or their ceiling, aka the front of the inchworm, and also their weaknesses or flaw in their ability, which is the back end of the inchworm. As someone learns new things about a topic, the front of their curve reaches forward, which increases their ceiling of ability. It increases their strengths and how good they are when they're at their best. This, however, causes a really stretched out curve to occur. To make the curve much more narrow so the person can be more consistent in their application of the skill, the back end has to be improved. So the person needs to target their weaknesses or their flaw abilities in order to increase that consistency. Once these weaknesses have been mastered and the floor has been raised, the person has effectively improved in their ability. They've taken a step forward, just like the inchworm. Then the cycle repeats. They reach out by learning new things and trying new things, and then they focus on their weaknesses to raise the floor, and the cycle repeats. Now, within the Inchworm method for learning a new skill, there are 2 types of knowledge. There is conscious competence, and there is unconscious competence. Conscious competence is when you're able to perform the skill, but you have to maintain focus while you're doing it. Think about when you first tried to learn how to drive a car. When you're learning, you have to think about so many different things at once, right? You're keeping under the speed limit. You're also keeping aware of all the cars around you. You're changing gears, you're indicating, you're checking blind spots. There is so much going on, and you have to stay hyper-focused the whole time, lest you crash. Unconscious competence, on the other hand, is when you're able to perform a skill without really thinking about it at all. If you've been driving for a long time, you've probably experienced that phenomenon when you realize that you've been driving for maybe 10 or 20 minutes, but you don't remember any of the trip at all. This is because the skill of driving is so well ingrained that you don't have to think about it. You're unconscious effectively while performing the skill. Not only that, but you're able to do other skills at the exact same time, such as change the music, talk to other passengers, or decide which type of schnitzel you're going to get from the pub for dinner. Now, both these conscious and unconscious competencies are within the same Inchworm curve for a particular skill. Typically, conscious competencies, those skills that you have to focus on, are on the ceiling side of your Inchworm curve. You've learned them recently, they're new things to you, and so you have to focus on them while you're performing those parts of the skill. If we take learning a language, for example, this might be the part where you're starting to incorporate idioms or metaphors into your speech. However, there are plenty of times when we're tired or we're stressed out or we're otherwise unable to perform at peak performance, and so these skills that we're still learning, still mastering, are not accessible for our brains. We find it really hard to remember all this new stuff we've learned, and so we fall back on the skills we have mastered, our unconscious competencies. Now, I referred to them as weaknesses before, but that might be a bit of a misnomer. It is simply the fundamental skills we have at the bottom end of our learning curve. In terms of learning a language, our hypothetical person from before who is learning about metaphors and idioms in their new language, their flaw or their unconscious competencies might be things like nouns and verbs, super basic things like mum, dad, dance, walk, jump, shout, right? All of these fundamental things that they probably learned a long time ago, they don't need to think about them. They don't need to practice them. They are simply there in their unconscious competency. So even when they're extremely stressed out, they're extremely tired, if I say to a person who's pretty good at a language, what's the word for car, they'll be able to regurgitate it immediately. It's kind of like if I said to you right now, what's 2 + 2? Without thinking, you said in your brain 4. You couldn't help it. It's kind of like saying, don't think of a pink elephant. Sorry about that. So to summarize this section, when we're learning a new skill with the Inchworm method, there are 2 parts. There is the part where we learn a brand new thing, a new information or a new skill, and that is now a conscious competency. We can do it, but we need to think about it consciously as we do so. The second part of the process is taking the things on our bottom end of our curve and absolutely mastering them. This turns them into unconscious competencies, and it means the entire back end of our Inchworm model moves forward. Now, when I first learned about this model, I was so excited because it made so much sense to me intuitively. It opened up a whole new way of thinking about learning. And I hope you are excited because it is a genius idea. By the way, I'm not taking credit, it's not mine. However, it does come with some dangers. Now, with this Inchworm method in mind, there are 2 main mistakes people make when it comes to learning. The first is ignoring weaknesses. So people only focus on reaching out and learning new things and stretching that curve. The second thing is only focusing on mastering skills. There is no new growth, no new learning, and so the bell curve gets very, very narrow. Both of these mistakes have different issues associated with them, so I'm going to talk about them now so you can ensure that you don't fall into this trap. So just before I move on and talk about the different mistakes and how to fix them, if you're enjoying the video, make sure you click the like button. It really helps me out and it tells the YouTube algorithm that you're enjoying my content and that it's helping you out. So click the like button and thank you very much for watching. Let's get into these 2 mistakes. So the first mistake of only focusing on building more strengths and skills and completely ignoring weaknesses is very typical of people who play video games, who play games like chess and poker, or any really activity that has an extremely high skill ceiling and has many opportunities to improve. The person gets hyper-focused on learning new things, getting new equipment, learning new strategies, at the complete disregard of any and all weaknesses. This pursuit of getting better isn't really going to work because the person, yes, does have a higher skill ceiling, but their weakest parts of their game or their lowest floor is still exactly the same. Similarly, when it comes to school and education, which is a big passion of mine, as you'd know if you've been on this channel for a while, we focus so much on teaching students the next thing, teaching students the next topic, getting them to learn the next skill, that we completely forget to give students time to master the skills we've already taught them. Now, I'm not throwing shade at anyone. The Australian curriculum at the very least is so dense that it's almost impossible to avoid this. So we need the students to work with their parents at home to hone and master these skills. But at the same time, this is one of those weaknesses where we focus on teaching students more and more and more without giving them time to practice those fundamental skills and master them. So as you can see from the graphic, and probably as you saw in your mind's eye as I was talking about this, only improving strengths and completely ignoring weaknesses causes a very stretched out inchworm curve indeed. The difference between the ceiling and the floor is so massive, it causes great inconsistencies in the person's application of the skill. So due to this inconsistency of having such a high ceiling and such a low floor, people can get really frustrated, and you've probably experienced this as well, where you get the feeling that you're taking 2 steps forward but then 3 steps backward. This is because on some days you're operating at your ceiling and some days you're operating at your floor. And as you learn more and more and more, the difference gets so much wider. You feel like on your best days you're the absolute best you've ever been, but then on your worst days you feel like you're useless and have learned nothing. And that's true. Because if you don't work on your weaknesses, on your worst day you actually haven't learned anything and you fall back into your absolute fundamental unconscious competencies and routines. And so this is the first type of plateau that people experience. They feel like they're not getting better because sometimes they're at that absolute floor. They feel like they just can't break through to that next level. So due to how frustrating and discouraging this part of the learning process is, it can sometimes cause people to completely abandon the skill altogether and just say, it's too hard, I can't improve. For those who don't give up, however, it can cause them to think erroneously that to get better, they just need to learn more things. And this is just doubling down on the problem that already exists and exacerbates it even more. And the final thing that makes this mistake of only focusing on strengths and ignoring weaknesses so bad is that we as human beings only compare our best to our worst. We don't actually compare apples to apples. We compare apples to oranges. And when our best is so much better than our worst, we get extremely frustrated and discouraged. Instead, if you're learning a new skill, and this is sort of a sidebar, make sure you're comparing your worst performance to your previous worst performance. You may feel like you've made no progress in an area, whether it's at work or at school or in a personal skill. But if you reflect 6 months, a year ago, you're going to see that you've improved drastically if you're comparing your worst to your previous worst. Now, I am by no means a guitar expert. However, I remember when I was very first learning guitar, I really struggled to make a G chord. I found it really hard to get these bottom fingers and the top fingers spread far enough that I could actually make that chord. Cut 6 months, a year later, I was learning bar chords, so the G bar chord, and I was really finding it hard as well. And I just kept thinking to myself, oh, I'm never going to be able to play guitar. I'm so bad at doing bar chords. I can't even press hard enough on the fret to make a nice sound. But if instead of comparing myself to all of these expert guitarists and seeing how fluently they make bar chords, I should be comparing myself to my previous worst of barely even being able to make a G chord normally. If I can fluently make a G chord and transition between the chords now, then yes, even if I'm finding it hard to make a bar chord, I can still see that I've made progress over the years. So the message that I'm trying to convey in this section, this mistake, is that if you're finding yourself struggling to learn a new skill and you're frustrated and discouraged, it might be because you've only been focusing on new things and haven't taken the time to master some of the other skills in your inchworm curve. Instead of learning some new things, it might be time to take a step back, master some fundamentals or things that you've learned a little while ago but haven't yet mastered, and turn them into unconscious competencies to narrow that bell curve and get some more consistency. On the other side of the coin, we have the people who only focus on improving weaknesses and trying to master all the fundamental skills before they go ahead and learn something new. Often people who fall into this category also fall into the category of a general fear of failure. They fear failure so much they're actually a bit resistant to learning new things just on the off chance that they don't pick them up straight away. So they resort to focusing only on those fundamental skills and continuing to master them. Think of a student or yourself when you were in school. Let's say a math student, because that's my favorite topic, and they've got a test coming up with 4 topics on it. One of the topics they know really well and they just get it intuitively, the other 3 not so much. I've seen it time and time again as a teacher, but students with this sort of setup where they know something quite well and don't know other things, often only study the one they already know. It makes complete sense though, because when they study the thing they already know, they keep getting questions right and it keeps feeling good in their brain. On the other hand, if they focused and practiced some of those topics that they weren't so good at, they might actually get some questions wrong in the learning process. For some students, especially those with a fixed mindset, this can be extremely daunting and scary, and so the students just avoid these topics altogether. This hyper-narrow focus on improving weaknesses and getting mastery over skills causes an extremely narrow inchworm. People who suffer from this mistake often cite that they try and practice, but they just can't improve. They're stuck at a plateau. But you can see the issue now, can't you? They're not actually improving because they're not learning new things and they're not reaching forward with their inchworm. They've brought their back legs so close to their front legs that they're essentially just one straight line, and they're very consistent, but they're certainly not improving at all. This is the second type of plateau, a more genuine plateau, because the person can't break through at all. But really, this invisible barrier, or the only thing holding them back, is their fear of trying new things and their fear of failure as a whole. And the final part of this video is going to be talking about how can this knowledge of the inchworm help you in your learning process. Well, first of all, just awareness of the concept itself helped me immeasurably when it comes to improving my mental game in poker. This was very specific back in the day, but I have applied this concept to almost every single thing that I've been learning in the future, and I've found it much more easy to progress in different skill acquisitions much more efficiently. You might have already begun self-assessing where you are in a particular skill that you've currently been learning. You might have self-assessed that you actually have the first mistake where you have a really wide inchworm. Or you might have self-assessed as the second type, a really narrow inchworm. Regardless, I hope you understand now what you can be doing to improve either error. Now, I'm not saying you would have had a crazy wide inchworm or a crazy narrow one, but typically people fall into one category or the other. I personally fell in the category of learning too much too quickly and not focusing on my weaknesses, so I found a lot of frustration in learning certain things. Now remember, it's all about balance and progression. You need to both learn new things, but then also master some other things that you've already learned and commit those to unconscious competence. This is the only way to move forward in a learning ability, and we're going to move the entire curve rather than just one end. Forward, then back. Forward, then back. For all the teachers out there, or parents, or anyone who knows a young person, I implore you to share this concept or this video with those kids. It's so important when you're learning and when you're young to understand that both learning new things and also mastering fundamentals are just as important as one another, and you have to do both to improve. There's plenty of students out there with a fear of failure who just need to get the incentive to learn new things and try. Having a growth mindset is so effective for learning because it allows the student to fearlessly reach out with the front of their inchworm. Not only that, but if students are aware of why it's so important for them to master fundamentals to raise that floor of their ability to get the inchworm's back end moving, it'll encourage them and give them a reason to actually do homework, to actually revise, because they can see the point of it. Usually students are resistant to homework not because they don't actually do the work, but because they don't see the purpose in it. They're bored by it because you haven't told them or explained to them why it's so beneficial to them. They think it's just a thing you're making them do because you're the devil. Remember to share with students that learning is a cycle. Learn, master, learn, master, learn, master, and progress forward through life like an inchworm. Now, if you've gotten this far in the video, thank you first of all so much, but also leave me a comment down below with what skill you're learning at the moment. I'd also love to hear about whether you were one of the people with a wide inchworm or a really narrow one, and what steps you're going to take to fix that moving forward. And to paraphrase The Mental Game of Poker by Jared Tendler, yes, that's him again. There will be a time when you feel like you've taken a huge step backward in a skill, or you've made no progress at all. When that time comes, come back to this video and rewatch this. It'll give you the framework you need to move forward once again, whether it's bring the front end forward or whether it's bring the back end forward. And that's it, guys. That's the inchworm method for learning a new skill and also the mistakes that come with it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure you share it with someone else who may need to hear this. Someone else who's trying to learn a new skill and who is struggling at the moment, whether it's because they haven't been focusing on their weaknesses or whether it's because they're scared or worried about trying new things. My name is Mark, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.